This is the fourth week during our gospel reading when we have read about Jesus being the bread of life. It's called the Bread of Life Discourse in the Gospel of John, and it's a pretty difficult reading, especially today, because today's reading has some cannibalistic overtones. You need to eat my flesh and drink my blood, and you wonder why Christianity was illegal for the first 300 years of its existence. So we need to unpack this a little bit, and there are kind of two traditional entry points into the interpretation for this. And I'm just gonna very quickly kind of say why we shouldn't use either of those two interpretive methods. The first is to say that when Jesus talks about eating his flesh and drinking his blood, he's really foreshadowing his death. He's getting ready to be crucified, and this is why we need to kind of be ready for his body and his blood to be shed. The problem, though, with that interpretation from John is that John places the bread of life discourse very early on. This is just chapter 6 in the Gospel of John. Whereas in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's much later. He talks about eating his flesh and drinking his blood at the Last Supper, which is right close to his crucifixion. So in John, we have this, you need to eat my flesh and drink my blood very early in his ministry, and it probably is not referring so much to his death as it is in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The other way to kind of look at this is to actually look at it in terms of the Eucharistic meal. So what we're doing here at communion, and we could spend hours, days, semester, years, a lifetime talking about different Eucharistic theologies. We could talk about the great Reformation debates of the 15th and 16th centuries. We could talk about transubstantiation and Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle, and while that would be a lot of fun for me, I have a feeling you would be bored to tears. The great thing about the Episcopal Church is no matter what you believe is happening up here at communion, what really matters is that you come and receive. The work is God's work to do. Our work is simply to come and receive, and through receiving, we begin to believe. At least that's our Episcopal take on Eucharist. So I'm gonna kind of table that as well. So we're not going to talk really about Jesus' death so much. We're not going to talk about Eucharistic theology so much. What we're going to talk about is the context in which this conversation with the disciples took place. Now, I haven't been the biggest fan of the Gospel of John for a while. I used to love the Gospel of John during my college days because I thought it was really direct. It was really easy to kind of understand. John is almost, he nails the divinity of Jesus. He gets that Jesus is divine, and he tells us over and over and over about how the Father and Jesus are one, and how, Jesus is God and human. But over the last couple of maybe decade or so, I've started to fall away from the Gospel of John, and I've really preferred Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I just think they're more, they're more kind of imaginative. They're a little more contextually based. But I read a book over the summer that was all about the early church, and the early church reading the Gospel of John, and it has me looking at John again with a new set of eyes. One major difference between the Gospel of John and the Synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, is the way that Jesus talks to his disciples. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the way they portray the disciples is kind of like a bunch of bumbling fools. The disciples don't really know what's going on. They're kind of confused most of the time. They end up betraying Jesus. Judas betrays him, but Peter denies him. And the Synoptics don't have a high regard for the disciples, as high. John, on the other hand, has a very high regard. John says that when Jesus goes to the disciples, they get it. He's able to kind of share who he is, and they get who Jesus is, and they kind of take off running. They've got a direct connection with Jesus. You don't have to have a mediator to be with Jesus, according to John. And it's given me this fresh set of eyes. So that's kind of by way of introducing what's going on with the Bread of Life discourse. That's kind of a long way of saying, here's what I think the context is. A couple of chapters before chapter 6, I think it's chapter 5, we've got the feeding of the 5,000. And so the disciples are out there with Jesus feeding the 5,000, turning the loaves and the fishes into enough food for the multitudes. And I think this event is utterly mesmerizing for the disciples. I think they go back with Jesus afterwards, and they're filled with this energy, this, not just their bellies, but the whole experience was just so incredible that they start asking Jesus, what was that all about? What's going on? Why is this something that you can do? And I think Jesus, and again, this is just my interpretation, but I think Jesus is trying to explain the feeding of the 5,000, not just in terms of kind of him dividing the food so that there's enough food for that day. I think he's trying to explain who he is by using bread as kind of, I don't want to say it's a metaphor because I think it's more than a metaphor. And he talks about how I'm the bread of life, how it's not just what I divide, it's actually who I am, that I literally am going to feed you forever. It's by kind of that connection with me that you will be fed. Now, this idea of connection, I didn't quite get that until I remembered my Aunt Sue, I've talked about before, is my mom's sister, and we're going to talk about Thanksgiving right now. So, I know it's August, but we're going to talk about Thanksgiving, because there's no better time. You can't start too early talking about Thanksgiving. My aunt, for as long as I can remember, has made homemade cranberry sauce. Now, I don't know how she makes it. I've watched her make it, but we're always yammering on, so I don't pay attention. But she gets a bag of cranberries, fresh cranberries, and I don't know, she puts them in a pot or something. Puts some sugar, I guess, and I think an orange, and I don't know. Voila, the cranberry sauce is made. And it's this delicious cranberry sauce that I always took for granted. I didn't really care about it when I was younger and even into my 20s. About 10 years ago, I went and had 2 Thanksgiving dinners. I went to my family's Thanksgiving in the early afternoon and my friend's Thanksgiving around dinner time. And my family, as you can probably imagine, and including my aunt, because my mom and my Aunt Sue were sisters, so they both go over the top. Everything is just tablecloths and fine china, and there's food, and there are a lot of rituals and traditions, and we have to pray a certain way, and it's all very organized and orchestrated, and, you know, like you do when you're doing Thanksgiving. At least that's the way I thought it was. And I went to my friend's house, and they were much more casual, just the 5 of us, sitting around practically a breakfast nook, no tablecloth, just the everywhere dishes. It wasn't paper plates, but it was dishes. And I know every family has their different traditions, and I just didn't realize what the cranberry sauce tradition was until they were bringing out the food. And they brought out the turkey and the stuffing and the sweet potato casserole that had marshmallows on it. Ours don't have marshmallows, but I was kind of intrigued by their marshmallows. And then they brought out the cranberry sauce on a plate. Yeah, you know where this is going, right? It was a log, one piece, kind of jiggling about. For those of you who don't know, you can get cranberry sauce in a can, and you can just kind of it out onto a plate. Where are the berries? I didn't say it, though. I just said it in my mind, because I was just thinking it. Where are the berries? But there were no berries, very translucent. You just kind of cut down the pre-marked lines from the can, just put it on your plate next to the turkey, which is fine. If you're a cranberry sauce can person, God bless you. More power to you. I'm okay. Don't worry. It all kind of tastes the same anyway. But I had this newfound appreciation for my aunt and for her cranberry sauce. Not because it was this spectacular recipe that has secret ingredients and, you know, I've never tasted any. No, it all kind of, I don't know, it's cranberry sauce, right? It tastes kind of the same. But I went home, and she was, you know, still at the house, and I gave her this big hug, and I was like, thank you for making cranberry sauce. It makes Thanksgiving, you know, like, because, it didn't bother me that we were sitting at a breakfast nook or anything else. And the turkey was actually quite phenomenal at this house. But the cranberry sauce, there was just something missing. And so we say, what are your ingredients? Well, I made it with, cranberries and sugar and oranges and love, right? We say, it's made with love. Well, I finally kind of got what that meant. Because that cranberry sauce, as delicious as it is, that my aunt makes me feel more connected with her. And her offering to me is in love, to the family that she makes every year, and is so, she's pretty proud of it, but, is an offering in love. And so now, every year since then, I take this gigantic spoonful, and I plop it down proudly on my plate, because I so cherish that tradition. I so cherish that love that she kind of gives through the medium of that cranberry sauce. And I think Jesus is kind of trying to say the same thing with himself. He's trying to explain how that feeding of the 5,000 kind of worked and why it works for him. And I can just imagine the disciples kind of going, wait, I don't understand. We have to eat you? And he's like, well, yes, I am the source. I am kind of what you are becoming, and you need to eat me in order to get it. It's just taking that love that we bake into the cranberry sauce to that next level. And I think that's where we begin to kind of, at least we have an entry point to understanding the Bread of Life discourse. It's about the connection. It's about that indwelling. It's about that sharing of love between God and us and one another. Which brings me back to kind of the Eucharistic feast that we're about to take. The Eucharistic feast does have connection, resonance with the Bread of Life discourse. And while we might not understand what that little wafer and that little wine is going to do for us, we don't necessarily have that mystery fully solved. I actually think the mystery enables the connection. I don't know how my aunt's cranberry sauce is made, and I've watched her make it up, a dozen times. But that's not the point. The point is that she makes it in love, and I receive it in love. And so when you come in a few moments to this altar, you might be confused, which is fine. Enter into the mystery. Receive the body and the blood in thanksgiving, rather than in kind of full understanding. And in humbling yourself and kind of being vulnerable to that, you might kind of reconnect with God, with Christ, with the people around you in a new way, as Jesus himself feeds us, that bread of life, as he gives to us and connects us with that love that knows no end, which he calls eternal life. May you and I taste and see that bread of life is good, is God, is Jesus. Amen.